Good evening. We are beginning. So first of all, I have to explain that I'm on this stool that's tall enough for a giant, and I might not be able. I feel like a little kid crawling up on it, so it may be awkward tonight. But we are starting a new series, and the title of the series is How Christians Behave. I posted it on Facebook that I was going to be doing this, and somebody wrote, is this series on how Christians should behave or how Christians behave? Because if it's the latter, I'm not interested. And I totally agree. This is on how we ought to behave. It's actually going to be a series about 12 or 13 or 14 weeks long on the Ten Commandments. Classically in the Catechism, excuse me, in the classic structure of the Catechism, there are 4 areas that are covered to educate believers and new believers and converts about the Christian life. Those 4 areas are the creeds, what we believe. That's the series we just finished. The commandments, ethics, how we ought to live. The Our Father, how do we pray? And worship, sacraments and liturgy. How do we worship God? So we are beginning that section now on how we behave, how we ought to behave. But before we talk about the Ten Commandments, let's talk for a minute about good stories and movies. And by the way, for you here and for all of you listening, I'm going to break this first lesson up into 2 sessions so I don't have to rush. Okay? So let's talk about movies and good stories. And let me tell you about 2 of them. The first one is set in a dusty old west town, somewhere out in the rough mountains of West Texas. And there's a small village that's been beset upon by a gang of outlaws, a gang of ne'er-do-wells. And the people of the village, their lives have been ruined by these criminals. You know, it's a typical movie, cowboy movie. They come riding in, shooting into the air, everybody running out of the streets, leaving dead bodies and rob banks. Out of the blue, this hero appears. And he appears to be maybe a little weak, kind of Audie Murphy-like. Destry, and Destry rides again. Shows up, carrying a parasol. Well, who is this guy? I'm the new sheriff. What? And at first he looks wimpish. He looks like he's not fit for the job. But he shows bravery and skill, and he takes on the bad guys. And at first, it looks like he's going to lose. This is any Mel Gibson movie. Gets beat to a pulp, left for dead. But he turns the tables, and he cleans up the town, and he restores peace. And, of course, the prettiest maiden in the village falls in love with him, and they climb up on his horse and ride off into the sunset. And the credits roll. That is a storyboard for many, many Old West movies. Now let me tell you about another movie. This story is set in some far-flung galaxy a long, long time ago, in a place far, far away. And it's this planet of peace-loving people, and they find they've been taken over by this evil intergalactic force which disrupts their lives, ruins their home, ruins their families, ruins their planet. Unexpectedly, this young hero shows up, doesn't look too terribly warrior-like, wields a lightsaber, teams up with a guy that's got fastest ship around, spaceship. At first, everybody agrees that this is a bad situation. These people are nobodies. But then they see that he really is a champion. He fights the evil empire. After he almost loses his life, He ends this evil empire and their gigantic starship, Death Star. And there's a love story in that too. So I hope you've noticed the similarities, because what George Lucas did was a Western set in outer space when he did Star Wars. But the fact is, this is what is called a meta story. And the same meta story can be found in hundreds of classic and well-known movies, books, stories that we tell around campfires. That meta story is the DNA of how to tell a tale. So let me talk to you about DNA for a minute. The code for your entire body is contained in every cell of your entire body. That's why you can put saliva in a tube and send it off to Ancestry.com, and they'll send you back information and tell you, unless you're an alien or something like Father Gabe, who they can't figure out his DNA. Normal people send it in, and in 6 weeks you go back to the results that tell you all kinds of stuff, what your hair color is, your eye color, your ethnicity, your everything about you. Every cell in your body has all of that information. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is the DNA of the Bible. I learned this when I was about 25 years old, and it changed my life. And if someone were to ask me, what's the first thing I ought to know and remember about Scripture, it would be this. Because once you see this pattern, all of Scripture starts unfolding in a way that you didn't see before. But before I get into these 5 points of biblical DNA, I want to share you one more story. A great and powerful king of a world empire, let's say the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire, world-conquering empire. This great, strong king arrives to rescue a small nation from an evil, murderous dictator. So he frees the people from the oppressors, and then he offers to make a covenant with them. Now, it does not matter where you turn in ancient literature, you're going to find what I'm about to share with you. The first thing the king establishes is who's in charge. And by the way, this is a covenant, not a contract. This is not something that we barter on and, well, no, I don't like that part. This is the king showing up, taking over, and saying, I'm in charge. If you don't like it, we don't have a covenant. I'm the one who makes the rules. I'm the one in charge. So that's the first thing he establishes. Then the second thing he establishes is, I'm not going to stay here in this backwater nation forever. I have harems and hanging gardens and a country to run, an empire to run. I've got to get back to my castle. I'm going back to Babylon or Persia or wherever. I'm going back. However, I am going to leave someone here who speaks for me, someone who represents me, someone that I will, if you will, give the keys to the kingdom. I'm going to leave representation. And then the third thing that king says, and I can show you this in scores of ancient documents, this exact same pattern. The third thing the king says is, here's what I expect of you. First thing, who makes the rules? Second thing, who do I leave here to enforce the rules? Third thing, what are the rules? Here's what I expect of you, and it is clearly laid out in these covenant documents of the ancient Near East. it's clearly laid out who the great king is, who his representative is, and what the deal is. What's got to be done? What do the people have to do? What does the representative have to do? What does the king have to do? There is this ethical section, and it's often a pretty big section in that covenant. So let's just make this up. The king says, I want 20% of everything you make in taxes once a year. I want once a year for you to go to the local temple of the king and burn incense to me and worship me as a god. And I want a third of your crops sent back to my country to feed my people. This is not bargaining. This is the king making his demands. Which leads to the fourth point. Who makes the rules? Who's in charge? Who enforces them? Who is the representation? What are the rules? And then the fourth point is, so what happens if we keep the rules or if we don't keep the rules? And it's always clearly stated in the covenant document, if you do this, all this good stuff will happen. If you do that, you're not going to like Thursday. It's not going to be good. 20% in taxes, a third of your produce sent to my country. Worship me as a god. If you do this, I will send in my armies and they will protect you and they will build roads for you and castle walls to protect your village and it'll be good. You'll be safe. You can live long and prosper. If you don't keep the rules, I'm going to send in my armies, yes, but they are going to plow up your crops and throw salt in your fields so you can't grow anymore. And they are going to take your wives as their own personal concubines, and they're going to sell your children into slavery, and they're going to burn your houses down. It's up to you. Take it or leave it. There's no bargaining here. You take it or leave it. The great king has spoken. And then the last part of that document always says, here's how this arrangement continues into the future. It's called a succession clause. When I, great King Jeremy, die, my son, Prince Jerome, is going to become the king. And here's how you cut covenant with him. Here's how you renew this covenant with him. When your children grow up, here's how they continue in the covenant with me. Now, I've just lined out 5 things. And those are the 5 points of what is called a suzerain vassal covenant. It is an ancient Near Eastern model that predates Moses. It predates Scripture. But it's worked into the very fabric of history and of social life in the Near East. So now what I'm going to do for the rest of this night, and it's not going to take long, is I'm going to unpack each one of them. And I'm going to give you a word to associate with it, and hopefully you can memorize this, and then you'll see it everywhere in the Scriptures. So I'm standing up off my high stool now. The first point of covenant is called transcendence. I never remember if it's an E or A. It's an E. Transcendence. In this section of the covenant, the king establishes who is above and beyond the situation. Man, all of this really impacts the locals here, but me, I'm the king. I got my own thing going. I'm transcendent. I'm above this. I'm above and beyond this situation. In a very real way, he isn't even a player in the game. He's kind of on the outside working his way in. He determines the rules. He's the Lord. The second point of a biblical covenant is called hierarchy. And we live, it just so happens, we live in a culture today that is very anti-hierarchy. You don't want to see anybody have actual authority, especially in the church, or else we can't be having that. But even in the home, breakdown of social structures in the homes and civilization itself, in the political arena and so on. We are living in a time of a kind of intellectual collapse of hierarchy. But hierarchy is the second point of covenant, which says who enforces the rules? Who is here to represent officially the transcendent one? And that's always written in the biblical record and in other records. The third point is called ethics. What are the rules? Line them out for me. I'm going to take a 1-minute rabbit trail and say this is a model for families too, by the way. And if parents instituted this model, life would be better for everybody. I have great parents. I have great and godly and good parents, and I love them to death. But when I was a kid, they did not know covenant. And they did not institute model anything like this. And I remember to this day, I remember getting in trouble for things I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do, or I didn't know I was supposed to do. And by trouble, I mean a razor strap. Because you should have known. Well, Dad, you should have told. Don't you tell me what I should have done. Covenant model. The hierarchy, the parents say to the kids, here's what's expected. Here's a list of the rules. Here's what you got to do. And if you do them, all this good stuff will happen. And if you don't, there are going to be consequences. But the rules are clearly laid out. Ethics. Point number 4. is called sanctions. And it asks the question, what are the consequences of keeping the rules or breaking the rules? If we keep them, what happens to us? If we don't keep them, what happens to us? The rules are not subject to debate, but they are subject to being obeyed or being disobeyed. In covenants found in the Bible, this is normally the longest part of the covenant, the biggest part of the covenant. Ethics and sanctions, usually this is just a word, a sentence, a phrase. This is almost just a blip. What's expected is quite detailed, and what happens if you do or don't do what's expected is very detailed. And then the fifth point of biblical covenant is called continuity. I'm going to complicate this just a little bit. I'm sorry. I'm going to attempt to possibly make it simpler by complicating it a little bit. In sanctions, there's always swearing. There's always an oath. Do you promise to do this? I promise to do this. Hand on the Bible. Hand to God. I promise to do this. You're making an oath. Continuity. So some people call this oaths. And continuity is always about how this thing continues into the future. Or a succession clause. And some people use that word, succession, instead of continuity. And so you end up with theos. Easy to remember, easy little memory tool to remember the model of covenant. Transcendence, hierarchy, ethics, oaths, succession, or the five that I started out with, which is how I learned it. Now, I'm almost finished, but I want to give you a preview of next week, and I want to leave you with something to think about. I do recommend a book. In fact, the book I think is in the process of being rewritten. It was written by this fellow when he was Presbyterian, and he's now an Anglican bishop. When I read the book, originally he was a Presbyterian, pastoring a church in Tyler, Texas, and he wrote a book called That You May Prosper by Ray Sutton. Ray Sutton ended up becoming an Anglican. He ended up becoming an Anglican bishop. He ended up becoming a bishop in Dallas, and he and I ended up becoming really good friends. It was like a big deal for me to meet him the first time because, like, dude, you wrote one of the 5 books that changed my life completely. And then we became good friends, and I hold the historic distinction of being the only man actually and literally shot with a gun by Ray Sutton. So that's my claim to fame. We were out in West Texas, out by Muleshoe, Father Sergio, Victor, Ray Sutton, and myself, dove hunting. And they came up with the bright idea for me to go down to the other end of this field, and they're up on a hill, and that way we'll cover the field from both sides. That's a beautiful idea, but when you implement it, Ray takes his gun, and there's a bird between him and me, and he goes, boom! And like one BB hits that bird, and the rest go flying past his target, and one lands square right there in my forehead. I've got a picture still of blood trickling down where Ray Sutton shot me. But it was worth it for him to impact me the way he did with his book. I really recommend his book. It's a 300-page book that unpacks this biblical idea of covenant. But what I want to finish with tonight is to tell you a few places where the covenant model shows up in the Bible. And then next week, I'm going to show you 3 examples in detail. It is found in the original mandate given from God to Adam when he establishes that he's the Lord. He sets Adam and Eve in the temple of a garden to care for it. And then he gives them this commission to be fruitful and multiply. There are consequences. Don't eat from this. If you do eat, there are ethics. Don't eat from this. If you do eat from this, here's what happens. There are consequences. The whole structure of the covenant, right there, right off the bat in the first couple of chapters of Genesis. It is the structure of the 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Transcendence, hierarchy. Exodus, all about the people of God emerging, the high priesthood and so on. Ethics, sanctions, continuity. The book of Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses and it being transferred, leadership being transferred to Joshua. And so you see this 5-point model as the structure of Moses' books. It is particularly the structure of the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll show you that next week. I'll model that for you a little bit. It is the basic model for every prophetic book in the Old Testament. Just pick one and go look at it, and Every one of the books basically says something like this. I don't care if you're talking Isaiah or Hosea or Jeremiah or whatever. They basically look something like this. I'm the Lord your God. You priests have done a sucky job. Transcendence, hierarchy, ethics. Here's what I told you guys to do, and I was going to bless you. Here's the things I wanted from you, but you didn't do it, and oh my Lord, it's going to be hell on earth for you. But there's going to be a remnant. There'll be continuity. There'll be a people that emerge from this, and I'm going to restore them and redeem them. That's basically the model of every prophetic book in the Old Testament. It is the structure of the book of Matthew. It is the structure of the book of Romans. It is, and I'm going to unpack this next week, the structure of the book of Revelation. I am convinced we can't understand Revelation if we don't understand covenant. And once we understand covenant, it's just like, oh my goodness, it's clear as can be. And here's where I end. It is the structure 2 times over of the 10 Commandments. If you can learn this covenant model, even the 10 Commandments are going to be more meaningful to you. I'm just going to give you a quick example of 3 or 4, and then we'll be done. But the first commandment, I'm the Lord your God, you should have no other gods before me. Transcendence. The second commandment, don't bow down to idols. It's about how the hierarchy worships this one God. Third commandment, ethics. Don't misuse the Lord's name. When it says, I'll get into this in a month, but when it says don't misuse the Lord's name, I kind of grew up with, if you say GD or something, then you're misusing the Lord's name. I'll tell you, a greater misuse of the Lord's name is, I'm a follower of Jesus, but man, I got this really good deal for you, and you sell him a piece of crap. That's misusing the Lord's name. A politician who has zero interest in actually following Jesus, using Jesus as part of his platform, that's misusing the Lord's name. The third commandment ties in directly with ethics, how we live, how we function in a proper way. Fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For on the 7th day, the Lord blessed the Sabbath. Sanctions is all about blessings and curses, consequences, good things and bad things happen. Keep this commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For on the 7th day, the Lord blessed that day. Sanctions. The 5th commandment. Honor your father and your mother, that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. He's not talking to individuals. I know people that have honored their father and mother and died when they were 10. I know people who didn't and lived to be 110. He's talking to people, to a culture, to a nation. As a general thing, a nation where this generation honors the generation before it, it has continuity. It endures. It lives long in the land that it has. Honor your father and your mother, that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. That's the 5th commandment. It's continuity. And then the other 5, same thing. It is 5 points of covenant again. So we're going to spend the next 3 months unpacking all of this, learning covenant together, learning the 10 commandments together. And I promise you that in the next 3 weeks, every one of you will be able to tell me the 10 commandments. In order, out of order, upside down anyway. I'm going to teach them to you. I was talking to Candace a couple of weeks ago about how politicians make a big deal about, we want the Ten Commandments back in the courtrooms. Which is fine. I mean, maybe we ought to put the Beatitudes in the courtroom instead, but okay, fine. But what I want to do is I want to go to every one of these politicians that says, we need the Ten Commandments back in the court, and say, what are they? You're so gung-ho for this. What's the fifth commandment? What's the eighth commandment? What are they? They don't have a clue. Most pastors don't have a clue. I said to Candace, do you know the Ten Commandments? And she tried to fake it. But when you don't know the Ten Commandments, you cannot. She finally admitted she didn't know. 10 minutes later, she had them all memorized in order and out of order. And a week later, I called her and said, what's the fourth commandment? Boom. Oh, good for you. What's the sixth commandment? Boom, 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 boom. So here's the deal. I'm going to treat you like children over the next few weeks and use a children's method to learn these commandments so that you will never forget them. And then we're going to unpack them one at a time and see how they apply to our covenant with God. So that's where we'll end tonight. Next week, we are looking in detail at the model of the covenant for the book of Revelation and the model of covenant for the commandments. And then we're going to jump off onto this journey of learning and understanding the Ten Commandments. Thank you.